naturalists. So I am gonna turn my video off though, just because my internet is being unreliable at the moment. So hopefully that will help save some data power here. Um, all right, let me just get my PowerPoint up. All right, so obviously today I'm here to talk to y'all about urban ecology. And a lot of times people kind of hear, the term urban ecosystem or hear urban wildlife and wonder like what the heck my job is, and what that really means. And I think that's simply just because people don't really realize how much wildlife and how much nature there really is in our cities. Um, so that's kind of what we're here to talk about today. And so one of the things that you might kind of be wondering is also, why are urban areas important to wildlife? And this slide here kind of starts to give you an idea of why that is. So this is just a satellite image of Earth at night of the United States. And you can see on this map pretty clearly where all of our cities are, because you can see the light shining from our cities from space. And the reason why I like to use this image is because it pretty clearly shows how much of the land we occupy, and just kind of how spread out our cities are. There's not really any area in the US that we can say is truly not impacted by people in some way. Some areas are certainly more impacted than others, but we kind of touch everywhere. Um, so um, One thing that's important to kind of keep in mind is, our cities are constantly growing. They're always changing. And so what I have here, these are satellite images of the DFW Metroplex from 1984 over here on the left to 2018 over here on the right. And you can see, the longer you look at these pictures, the more you will notice. The first thing you'll probably notice is how much the footprint of the Metroplex has grown, especially in the kind of northeast parts of DFW. But you'll also notice that the development within the Metroplex has gotten a lot more dense in this time frame as well. Um, So I have here, I don't know if anyone wants to guess, maybe in the chat. Anyone know what this shape is? I'm trying to give you a sense of scale of just how big Texas really is. Um, let's see. There we go. Someone put it in there. Yeah, it's Connecticut. So Connecticut, so the DFW Metroplex is roughly the size of the state of Connecticut. It's actually a little bit bigger, depending on, what counties you want to include in your definition of the DFW Metroplex. And there are several other states that we are also bigger than. Connecticut is just easy to use because it's kind of rectangular shaped. And so the reason why I have this on here is to remind y'all Texas is huge. Now, I know y'all don't live in the DFW Metroplex, but I'm sure comparisons could be made for Central Texas as well, because our cities in Texas are huge. So when we look at this kind of previous series of photos, it's important to keep in mind that these changes are not happening on a small scale, right? They're happening on the scale of a state. So we've got a huge area and we have a lot of land in DFW. So here's another example of just how gigantic Texas is. This is a tweet I came across where this guy points out that the city center of Siena, Italy, which has a population of about 30,000 people, is about the same size as this highway interchange in Houston. That's pretty crazy, right? Like our cities are huge and we're also very spread out. We don't have we have pretty low density development in Texas. Um, and there's some challenges that come with that, but there's also some opportunities that come with that. So, what is urbanization? Y'all know this, I'm sure. So, urbanization is basically the process of cities and towns coming into existence and also becoming larger. So it's rural areas being developed into cities. And so when this happens, you have more people moving to an area. Um, you have changes in the landscape and also kind of changes in the way of life. So you tend to have greater per capita resource consumption. And also people are not dependent on local natural resources. So if you think about, the best example of this is our food. If you think about where the food in the grocery store comes from, most of it is not coming from, your local area, right? It comes from somewhere else. So we're not as connected to the resources that exist in our communities. So Texas also has this kind of mythology of being this wild, rural, rugged state. And there are definitely parts of Texas that are pretty wild and rugged and rural. But as far as our population, Texas's population has been majority urban since the 1950s. And today, over 85% of Texans live in urban areas. And this is not something that is going to change. Um, the urban population in Texas is expected to double in the next 40 years. In this area, that just appeared in this triangle going from DFW to San Antonio to Houston. Um, that is known as the Texas Triangle Mega Region, and it's one of the largest and fastest growing mega regions out there. And most of the growth that we see in Texas is expected to occur within this area. And I know y'all down in Central Texas have seen a lot of this, as well as we have. If anyone has spent any amount of time driving on I-35 in the last decade, you've seen this firsthand. Um, I went to school in San Marcos and I worked in Austin for a couple of years. And boy, Austin and San Antonio sure are trying to merge into one city the way Dallas and Fort Worth have, right? Like all of those cities that used to be pretty tiny between the two are really starting to fill in. Um, so it really just kind of go, and some people predict, some projections show that eventually this kind of whole area is just going to be development because there's just so much demand, and the population is growing so quickly. So here's another way to look at this. This is a map that has the counties of Texas sized by their population size rather than their geographic size. And this one really just kind of drives home the point of where the population of Texas lives. We are very heavily weighted towards the eastern half-ish of the state because like West Texas just totally disappears, right? Like you've got a few little bubbles with Amarillo and Lubbock and El Paso, but for the most part, West Texas is like gone. So especially the eastern portions of the state, and the valley is growing pretty quickly too. All right, so why talk about urban ecosystems? Well, they are becoming an increasingly significant part of the landscape that we have here. And urban ecosystems operate sort of under a different set of constraints, a different set of circumstances than our more kind of natural rural ecosystems. So one of the most apparent things, one of the most kind of immediately obvious differences that we see with urban ecos with urban ecosystems is habitat fragmentation. So this is pretty self-explanatory. This is where you have a large chunk of natural habitat and it gets split up and broken up and developed and used for different purposes. So you go from having one tract of land that's managed the same to having multiple smaller tracts of land that likely all have different conditions on the ground and different management structures. So some of it may be turned into like schools or shopping centers, streets, parking lots, while some of it might be used for agriculture or might become a park or just be left as open space. And that park and that open space, though there may be both relatively natural, they're certainly going to have different management strategies. So when we have these things kind of changing, um, so when development comes in or other things, that is going to impact the process of secession, which you've probably talked about so far. You've probably already talked about this in your training classes, but secession is basically the process of an ecosystem developing from one point to another. So like the progression of an ecosystem reaching towards stability. And sometimes that state of stability is an old growth hardwood forest. Sometimes that state of stability is a prairie. But when someone comes in and develops, you're going to knock back whatever climax community is present and it kind of revert it to a lower state of succession. Um, and then how that community develops in the future is going to be influenced by the changes on the ground. So what are some things that we change? Well, one is soil functions. So we typically take soil for granted, really, and don't think about how important it really is. But soil is complex and it has a lot of nutrients and chemical and physical processes going on inside of it. Um, and it really is literally the foundation of our ecosystem, right? So, soil helps to provide nutrients to plants and animals. It also sequesters carbon and filters and traps pollutants. What we see a lot of times in urban areas where development is happening is they'll kind of come in and they'll scrape off the O and the A horizon, which if you look at the soil profile, so those are the top two horizons, the top two layers of soil structure. And that is where the majority of the organic material and nutrients are found. So you're removing a lot of nutrients that the ecosystem needs when you get rid of that. You also, a lot of times they'll bring back foreign topsoil. So when they need to, so they go in and they remove a bunch of dirt, and then when they need to fill dirt, they just kind of bring in fill dirt from a random location that may not be native to that area, that may have different chemical composition, or it might have some hitchhiking plant seeds on it that don't belong there. Um, Also, we tend to see soil compaction. So in areas where there's a lot of human traffic, you can get basically the soil gets smushed down, and soil should have air pores in it. And so when that happens, it makes the soil really compact and dense. And so that contributes to things like runoff. So the water, instead of absorbing down into the soil, will just kind of run off. And also can cause plants to die because there's just not, they're not able to get what they need from the soil. So speaking of runoff, water quality is another issue that we have in urban areas. So not all urban streams look like this. I might be being a little bit unfair here, but there are plenty of them that do look like this. And water quality can be an issue for a lot of reasons. So a lot of the times, I feel like the issues with water bodies, urban water bodies in urban areas don't start with the water body itself. It starts with all the things that are happening around the water body, like development. So, for example, all impervious cover. There we have a lot of impervious cover in urban areas. All of our roads, all of our rooftops, all of that stuff is stuff that when water hits it, it doesn't absorb, it runs off. And so we have water, um, instead of kind of hitting the ground and filtering down into the ground in the place that it lands, it runs off to somewhere else. And that can, depending on where it's running off to, a lot of times that can cause erosion. Also, as water is moving across the ground, it tends to pick up contaminants. So things like fertilizers and trash and, oil residue and all that stuff, bacteria, it gets picked up and deposited into the water body that it hits. Um, that can lead to an imbalance in the nutrients that are found in the water, which, if you get too many nutrients, you can end up with eutrophication, which is basically where you get so many nutrients, it causes an algal bloom, and you basically have too much production happening in the water body, and that can lead to a lack of dissolved oxygen, which can kill fish, and cause other problems in the ecosystem. Also, with all that impervious cover, we don't have as much groundwater recharge because, again, the water isn't hitting the ground and filtering in. Um, we the increase in the amount of water and also the typically rapid rate of flow of the water can lead to bank destabilization. And a lot of times people will try and fix that by channelizing the stream. And so channelization is, people see these nice meandering streams and river and look at it and think, gosh, that's inefficient. If only it went in a straight line. And so they straighten out the course of the water body. And that causes a lot of issues. And sometimes they'll actually pave it like this, um, which the problem with paving it is you're removing any natural element from the water body, and you're also going to cause an increase in the speed of the water as it moves through the channel, as well as an increase in the temperature of the water. So whenever you have concrete like this, you have to be really careful of where that concrete ends, unless you're going to pave all the way to the ocean, because where it comes out, you're typically going to have worse erosion because it's coming out faster. And also, this paving, it's not gonna last forever either, right? Like, you can already see the plants trying to retake that riverbank. Um, so it's really hard to overstate the importance of vegetation to water quality. So plants are really, really important, and we need to try as much as possible to maintain plants along our edges of water bodies, because around our riparian areas, So places where there are streams and creeks and stuff, those habitats are really sensitive habitats, and plants are really what protects them and keeps them safe. So our native plants have great, really long, deep roots that hold soil in place, they hold water in place, and they slow down the speed of the water. And all of those things are really important for preventing erosion. Um, and as they slow water down, they also filter that water and make it more clean, and remove contaminants. So channels that maintain their natural vegetation tend to be more stable, and they also provide important habitat for wildlife, um, and increased groundwater discharge. So another issue we have in urban areas is the urban heat island effect. So all of our built environment is really hot. And this is pretty intuitive if you have ever stepped outside barefoot on pavement in August in Texas, right? It's gonna burn. So our concrete and our built environment is really, really good at holding on to heat. And so when you have a whole lot of it in an area, it can actually increase the ambient temperature of the area. So it's estimated that the heat island effect is so great that in a city with 1 million people, on average, the temperature is basically 2 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit higher. But at night, that difference can be as high as 22 degrees Fahrenheit, because when the sun goes down, natural ground is really good at like letting go of that heat and cooling off, but the concrete is going to hold on to it. So if those days that you wake up and it's 6:30 in the morning and it's 80 degrees outside, you have the heat island effect to thank for that. We've already had a couple of days here in DFW where it was 80 degrees very early in the morning. I hope y'all are maybe faring a little bit better than we are so far this year. So this has a lot of impacts. For one, it's more energy that we have to consume. We have to work harder to cool off our buildings, which leads to increased air pollution. Um, and it also can lead to a longer growing season, which can impact other things in the ecosystem. So another problem that we have with urban areas is dispersal barriers. Excuse me. So dispersal barriers are basically things that prevent the movement of wildlife from point A to point B. And so this park right here is a really good example of this. So this is a great little natural area that we have in Fort Worth. There's great prairie fragments and lots of native plants here. But if you look at where it's located, so it's totally surrounded by like houses and schools, and there's a fracking pad there, I think. Um, and then this up here to the north is I-30. So if you're a mouse and there's no more resources for you to live your little mouse life over here, and you want to get over here, good luck crossing I-30 to get there, right? Like that's a pretty significant barrier to dispersal. And so when that happens, we have wildlife that can't navigate the landscape as they would like to. It can lead to decreased gene flow and other issues with the population. In urban areas, we also tend to have more exotic species introductions. Now, exotic species are found everywhere. This is not just an urban problem, but because we have so many people moving things around, we tend to have more invasive species in urban areas. And so there is a difference, I should say, between an exotic species and a invasive species. So an invasive species is something like, our friend bastard cabbage here or Nandina. So that's something that escapes cultivation, and then reproduces prolifically and causes, so to be an invasive species, it has to cause environmental harm, harm to human health, or harm to the economy. And so if it does one of those three things, then that's an invasive species. Now, exotic species might be invasive or they might not. So this would be something like a rose, right? Like roses are not going to typically escape cultivation and grow freely on their own. But they're still not going to provide the same, they're still not going to have the same benefit that a native plant species would have if it was planted in that same place, because our native animals have evolved to survive on our native plants. And so bugs like bees and butterflies and also birds, that might rely on those plants, um, can't use a rose in the same way that they could use mealy blue sage or something that is native to the area. We also have changes in our disturbance regimes. Y'all have probably talked about this too, already in your training, but we had some historic disturbances that were, um, you know, naturally occurring in our ecosystems here in Texas. And that's things like migrating herds of bison, naturally occurring wildflowers, floods, and droughts. And now we tend to alter those things. Like, we don't have free roaming bison anymore. We just don't. If you do see a random roving herd of bison somewhere in Texas, let me know. And I'm not talking about like Caprock Canyon State Park, but if you just see one, one day out in Waco, let me know. But they, so we have a lot of things that have changed, and these naturally occurring disturbances that did things like redepositing nutrients into the soils of the floodplains or preventing the growth of woody plants in our prairies has kind of changed the structure of our ecosystem. We also, and so we have all different environmental constraints. So a lot of our city parks look like this, which is mowed grass and trees, right? And that's cool, but because some places need, we need activity. We need space for human recreation as well. That's an important thing. But this is pretty limited in what it does for wildlife, right? Like if you're a deer, where are you going to hide here, right? You're pretty out in the open. And there's also probably not much food available here. So your wildlife is having to work with less shelter and less food. But in some cases, they might have more food, but it's not the type of food that they need. So sometimes we have people who leave food out for wildlife, which you should not be feeding wildlife. The only feeder that you're allowed to have is a bird feeders in your backyard. Other than that, do not feed wildlife. That's the rule. Okay, you heard it from me. Um, so we have people that may be feeding deer in their neighborhood, which is going to support more deer than what should be in the neighborhood. And also, the deer aren't going to get proper nutrition. And we also don't really have large predators in our cities. Large predators and people, there tends to be a pretty low tolerance for having large predators in our communities. And so if you're feeding an animal that is a prey species and there's no predators to take it out, then to naturally reduce that population, then you're going to have whatever species it is you're feeding is going to become overpopulated pretty quick. So when we talk about plants, there are, in general, we can kind of categorize our urban plant communities in three different ways. So first we have our remnant plant communities, which is exactly what it sounds like. So these are the kind of fragments of natural habitat or similar to natural habitat that remain kind of untouched, unaltered, or close to what their natural state was. Then we have the colonizing communities. So these are plant communities that have experienced some sort of recent disturbance, and now they are, they got knocked back on that scale of succession, and they are, um, and they are now moving forward. Now, sometimes you might get lucky and they grow back as natural habitat or similar to what was there. But a lot of times you'll end up with invasive species there instead, because whenever you create a disturbance and disrupt that natural plant community, you run the risk of you open up an opportunity for invasive species to become established. So you might end up with our good friend privet. I don't think it's I know you have it in Central Texas, but I don't think it's as abundant in Central Texas as it is here in DFW. We've got a lot of green spaces in DFW that are basically just turning slowly into privet forests because it is so out of control here. So the third category is planted communities. Planted communities are our landscaping. These are the plants that we choose to plant. And so this is where, what we plant can make a really big difference. In terms of what benefit wildlife is going to be able to get from it. And so there are lots of native plant gardens out there that do great things for wildlife, but I'd say most of our planted communities probably look more like this picture, where it's dominated by non-native species that are providing little benefit to wildlife. So, how do species respond to all of this? How does wildlife cope? Well, they've got three options. So, when development happens, they can move, which sounds really great and easy, but in reality, it's kind of difficult. So, moving is basically leaving where they are and hoping that they can find a suitable habitat somewhere nearby that has the resources they need to survive. But that is often not super realistic because of, dispersal barriers. They might not be able to leave and go somewhere else. But also, if there is a nearby patch of habitat that has what they need to survive, it is very likely that there are other critters already living there that probably are not too keen on sharing their space with a newcomer, right? So their second option is to adapt to the change that has occurred. So, maybe they lose their trees, but that's fine because they don't really need the trees or something. So they're able to adapt to whatever change has occurred and still be able to stay in that area. We've got some species that are really good at doing this and some species that are definitely not good at doing this. And finally, if they're not able to go somewhere else and they can't survive at, with the change that has occurred, then they're not going to be able to survive. So we can broadly lump wildlife into two categories. So on one hand, we have the generalists. These are the species that can live just about anywhere and eat just about anything. Um, they're they've got lots of resources that they can pull from. They're not picky. So these are things like our raccoons and our coyotes. They eat a lot of different stuff. They live a lot of different places, right? On the other end of the spectrum, we have our specialists. These are things that have a very narrow and specific list of things that they need in order to survive. So this is a good example of this is the horned lizard, where over 95% of their diet is harvester ants. So if harvester ants are gone, horned lizards are going to have a hard time surviving, right? So it could be related to diet, could be a specialty. They might have a special type of tree that they nest in, like the red-cockaded woodpecker that only nests in mature pine trees that have a fungus, a specific type of fungus that makes the wood of the tree softer so they can excavate their nest easier. Like that's a very specific requirement that you need to have. So what do we think happens in urban areas where we're removing resources? Well, it's pretty intuitive, right? We have an increase in the generalist and we have a decrease in the specialist. So generalists are more likely to thrive in urban environments because they have a wide range of resources that they can rely on. Specialists are going to have a much harder time because if the one thing that they kind of specialized on is gone, they're not going to be able to persist. So I'm going to kind of look at what this means along the urban to rural gradient. So this graph is pretty intuitive. If I asked you, do you have more species diversity in downtown Austin or not downtown Austin, right? You're gonna say there's gonna be more in the rural area. And so as we move from highly developed areas to less developed areas, we tend to have a greater diversity of species. So why is that? What determines which species are able to persist in the face of urbanization? So one thing that's really important is what your remnant vegetation patches look like. And I've got a couple of examples of that for y'all. So this is a small park. It's about 11 acres in size. This is a Master Naturalist project up here. And it is a native prairie remnant, and it has lots of really great plants, and it's a good space. It's a great little park to have, but it is 11 acres in size, right? And when you start looking at the surrounding environment, you realize that this little patch of habitat is really an island, right? Because you've got a busy road, you've got houses, you've got warehouses, you've got a school. So that means that anything that has a home range size that is greater than 11 acres is going to have a pretty hard time surviving just here. Now, the point of this is not to say that 11-acre patches of natural habitat are not important, because they absolutely are very important, but I am just, and we need more of these, please, but the point is that you are limited in what species can live here based on the size, the shape, and the connectivity to other habitats. So species to live here either have to have a small home range size, or they have to be highly mobile. So something like a bird that can easily fly to another patch of habitat. So this is another example. So this park is a little bit bigger in size. This one's maybe around 40 acres. And you can see it's a different type of habitat. It's a bottomland, riparian habitat. But it's pretty similar in that, there's houses and a busy road surrounding it. But 40 acres is probably not that much different than 10 acres in the grand scheme of things. But what really makes the difference is when you zoom out, this little park is connected by this creek to a much larger, like 700 something acre green space, right? And that makes a huge difference in terms of, when we're talking about connectivity, this is what we're talking about. So you have wildlife that can kind of get from point A to point B here. So you have more species that can use this area because of that connectivity. And a lot of times in urban areas, our creeks and rivers and streams, our waterways are super important for wildlife transportation because it's really hard to build in water. So a lot of times our creeks are what is left behind that is kind of spared from development. So maintaining those natural vegetation buffers can really allow it to be a transportation corridor for wildlife. Um, so, looking at this picture, this is big and it's great, but there's still probably a lot of like edge influence here. So there's still probably a lot of influence from the kind of exterior. You don't really have a whole lot of interior habitat until you kind of start looking at something like this. So this is the Great Trinity Forest in Dallas. This is one of the largest urban forests in the United States. It's a couple thousand acres in size, I think. And when you're talking about that type of size, then you can really kind of have that more interior habitat that's going to be buffered from the effects of the edge. Um, and so something like this, you are going to be able to have species that really need that interior habitat. And so we do get some kind of more rare species that will pop up in this area. And also, if you start looking at this map, you can see some little creek channels and stuff that connect, through neighborhoods to this area. So it's really important to have large green spaces like this. So what else can determine which species persist? Well, another thing is competition with exotic species. So what exotic species have been introduced and, how harmful are they to the native species? So things like, our house sparrows taking up all of your bluebird boxes and nesting cavities. That's direct competition from exotic species. Also, what non-native predators are present? Cats are great, but they're furry little murder machines and they kill billions of birds and other wildlife every single year. So the presence of cats in an urban area and their abundance can absolutely impact what species can be found. Also, what type of plants are you planting? Are you planting non-native exotic species that are not really going to provide a benefit for wildlife, or are you planting native plants that really can help, provide food and shelter for wildlife? Excuse me. Supplemental feeding also it has an impact. So, even if you're not putting out cat food for your raccoons, which I know none of you are because you're all master naturalists now, so you all know better. But even things like bird feeders, even though it's generally okay to have a bird feeder, if you think about it, when you're putting out a bird feeder, you are um, providing a benefit for the birds that come to that feeder. So that that doesn't necessarily mean that you're hurting species that don't come to that feeder, but you certainly are giving a boost to the species that do. Also, residual pesticides. So things like herbicides and insecticides, those things can accumulate in the environment. Um, if you're using heavy insecticides to get rid of bugs and stuff, It can certainly harm the populations of species that that rely on insects and bugs for their diet. Also, things like rodenticides can accumulate in the environment, can accumulate across trophic levels. So what I mean by that is, okay, you have rats, you put out rat poison, the rats die, or the rats get sick and wander off. And dead or dying, an owl comes along and eats them. Now, obviously, it's going to take a lot more poison to kill an owl than it would a rodent. But if that owl eats 50 poisoned rodents, it can kill the owl. Or it could kill, same thing with coyotes and bobcats. It can, the poisons tend to accumulate in the systems of our top predators, and it can have the unintended consequence of killing those predators. And then you're losing your natural pest control, right? So I really recommend don't use rodenticides if you've got a rat problem or a mouse problem. I think it's more, it takes a while to kill them with those poisons anyway. So I think it's more humane to just, get a good old fashioned snap trap and get it over with quickly. And you don't have to worry about it accumulating in the environment. All right. So on the not so intuitive end of things, kind of looking at that same scale, except instead of talking about biodiversity, we'll talk about biomass. As you move from a rural area to a more developed area, we tend to see a greater amount of wildlife. And that kind of doesn't really make sense when I first mention it. So let's talk about why that is. Well, some species, it turns out, are just really good at living alongside people. These are what we call urban exploiters. Excuse me, a little bit stuffed up today. So urban exploiters are species that really almost kind of prefer to live next to people. They're really good at taking advantage of anthropogenic resources. And these are species like pigeons, where you're not at all surprised to see one in downtown Houston. But if you were at Big Thicket, you would probably be wondering why there's a pigeon there, right? Like, it wouldn't make sense. And so the paper that initially talked about this was focused on birds. So the examples are all birds here, but I think some of these things also apply to other species as well. So in the middle, you have species like urban adapters that are urban adapters. So these are kind of our suburban backyard birds. These are things like flycatchers or eastern phoebes. These are things that are pretty common backyard birds, but it would be a little surprising to see one in a developed area. So they have a decent tolerance for development. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have urban avoiders. So these are species that really do not do well with human development and disturbance. A lot of times these are ground nesting species like, quail and turkey that just, don't, they can't tolerate too many people. These are specialists, they're sensitive to changes in the environment. So what makes an exploiter a good exploiter? Well, you can't be afraid of people, and you are also totally cool with using the resources that humans provide. So something like a grackle has no problem snacking on the French fries in your shopping cart, right? Like, that's just how they want to live their lives. So Also, exploiters typically have low territory maintenance, and they're gregarious, so they live in groups. Um, they also tend to be non-migratory. They don't move from point A to point. They don't necessarily need to migrate because they have the resources that they need that are available year round because they're relying a lot on human resources. Um, Being an exploiter is also associated with behavioral flexibility, which means if something changes in the environment, they're more likely to try something new. And that is also associated with relative brain size. So they tend to be kind of intelligent to be able to figure out how to navigate the environment. They also tend to be cavity nesters, which means that they are comfortable nesting in buildings and things like that, and don't necessarily need trees or habitat on the ground to lay their eggs. But what I want you to know, and what is really important, is that in spite of all of these things, urban areas have a lot of biodiversity. And sometimes it almost doesn't really make sense for the species that we see in urban areas to be in urban areas. Um, but they are, and it's great. And so don't go away from this talk thinking, wow, urban areas really suck because there's no nature, because that is not the point of this talk. There is, they have some different challenges that are not presented in more rural areas, but we've got a lot of species that are able to persist. So this park, this is the one that I used as the example for the dispersal barriers. In this park, there are over 1,400 species that have been documented on iNaturalist, and it's about 200 acres in size. That's a lot of diversity. So how is it that all of these species are able to still survive in urban areas, even though it may seem like the odds are stacked against them? So the word for that, the word for adapting to urbanization is synurbanization. Um, and so, how does wildlife do that? Well, urban wildlife has a different set of stressors than more rural wildlife in rural areas. Um, for one, they may alter their activity patterns either in response to human activity or a response to changes in how their predator or their prey behaves in an urban area. So you may have some species, like our urban carnivores, like coyotes and bobcats. Coyotes are more active during the daytime in rural areas, and in urban areas, they are more active at night because they don't want to be around people. Now, that can have, that shift in activity can impact other parts of their lives as well. Just like if we were to change from working a day shift to a night shift, right? Like if I was working a night shift, well, maybe the place that I normally like to go and get food from isn't open at 3 a.m. when I take my, lunch break. Um, so the same kind of thing happens if, a coyote is typically, you know, mostly relying on squirrels, which are active during the daytime, and they are not active during the daytime, and then they switch to nighttime, they're going to have to find a new source of food that's more nocturnal, right? And that can also impact prey. Like if you're a rabbit and you didn't have to worry about coyotes much before, but now they're active when you're active, that's more pressure for you. Um, Noise pollution can also be a significant thing. Our urban areas can be noisy sometimes, and that can have an influence on species that rely on vocalization to communicate with each other. So things like birds and frogs that are calling to find mates and things, there have been some studies that show that they call louder in urban areas, call louder and more frequently, to try and um, compensate for the louder noises. Also, with that heat island effect, we tend to have warmer temperatures, which can lengthen the growing season, which might also alter the reproductive period for some species, which might, um, could potentially be good, but it could also be bad. So, like if you're a species that you tend to have all of your babies at the same time to, as like a predator avoidance strategy, if those babies are more spread out, then the likelihood of the individual getting picked off by predators is more likely. We also have an increase in disease spread in urban areas because there's less habitat available in urban areas, so we tend to have species occurring at greater densities in urban areas. Um, and if we've learned anything from the last 2 years, if you have more individuals closer together than usual, then the likelihood for disease spread is greater, right? Um, and high densities can also impact plant communities. I'll pick on deer again. If you've got too many deer in your neighborhood, they're going to eat all of the plants. And if all of the plants are eaten, that's going to hurt the deer themselves, but also anything else that was relying on those plants. And in urban areas, one thing that, more rural individuals don't really have to deal with is cars. And road mortalities can be a really high impact on urban species. So I'm going to talk briefly about a study that my predecessor in this position did here in DFW several years ago, where they looked at bobcats. So bobcats in DFW, and I think in other parts of Texas too, are a little bit unique compared to bobcats in other parts of the world. Because so bobcats, unlike coyotes are omnivores, they'll eat just about anything. Bobcats are obligate carnivores, which means they only eat meat. And that is significant because that means that they are more of a specialist than a generalist. So typically, right, specialists don't do very good in urban areas. So bobcats in most parts of the country are not really considered an urban species. They are typically found on the urban fringe, so they'll be on the edges of cities, but not in the city itself. But here in DFW, we've got them all over our cities. So there was a study done that was kind of the impetus for this study is what's going on and how are our bobcats navigating the area. So they took GPS collars and they tagged 10 individuals and collected over 18,000 locations. And they also had a camera trap study that captured 279 photos of 49 different individuals. And you can identify an individual bobcat by looking at its spotting patterns. Sort of like how no two zebras have the same stripes, no two bobcats have the same spots. So what they found was really in line with what we know about urban carnivores in other areas. So they found that the bobcats had higher population densities and smaller home ranges. Now, when I say higher population densities, I don't mean that we have more bobcats in DFW than a rural area. That's not what I mean. I just mean that where we have bobcats in DFW, they are at higher densities because there's less space. And so the reason why we think that they are at higher densities with smaller home ranges is that we have abundant resources. We have lots of rodents, which is their primary food source. We have enough resources for them to survive, but habitat, the space is limited, so they have to kind of live closer together than they would probably like to. They also have an increase in nocturnal activity compared to their rural counterparts, and they avoided areas with high human activity. And they also found that creeks were important travel corridors. And so all these green spots that you see, that's a location of one bobcat that was being tracked. You can see how frequently it kind of uses this creek, these little waterways, to get from point A to point B. So raptors. Some raptor species do good in urban areas, some do not. In general, raptors that eat small prey do well because we have a lot of small birds, we have a lot of insects, and we have a lot of rodents in urban areas. So something like a Mississippi kite or a screech owl, or a red-tailed hawk that eats a lot of rodents, um, these animals do well in urban areas. As you would expect, raptors that have large home range requirements are not going to do good. And then one thing that I think is funny in sort of a morbid way is global studies have shown that vultures tend to increase their abundance in the early stages of urbanization, probably because there's a lot of dead stuff available. And then once, that kind of new phase of urbanization wears off, then the vulture populations will stabilize. Also, beneficial or a trait that is also correlated with likelihood to be able to persist in urban areas is the use of new nesting structure. So being kind of willing to try novel things in the environment. So other common trends in urban wildlife that we see is less migratory behavior. So you might have some species, like the Canada goose is a good example of this, that is typically migratory, but if it has what it needs where it is, then it might not migrate and it might kind of become resident. So if there's abundant resources available year round, and the temperature is moderate enough and they don't have that strong internal push to migrate, um, you might see a reduction in the migratory behavior. Prolonged breeding season, we've talked about a little bit already. And then, so this next one is interesting. Greater longevity, but worse overall health. So in urban areas, sometimes we find that individuals are living longer than the expected average lifespan in that species, but they may not necessarily be as healthy. And so they think that the reason for this has to do with, you know, again, abundance of human resources, and also sometimes a reduction in the number of predators that are available. So this squirrel that I have a picture of, this is not a squirrel that got dumped in paint. This is a squirrel that is piebald, which means it's partially white and partially normal squirrel color, right? Um, in urban areas, it is more likely that individuals with genetic differences like this, or albinism or melanism, um, are able to survive to adulthood and maybe even reproduce because there's fewer predators. And so um, they might, typically this squirrel is not very well camouflaged, right? And so that would make it an easy target. And it still is an easy target, but its chances of surviving are greater in an urban area than a rural area. You also might have animals that maybe get hit by a car but they don't die, and maybe they just break a leg. And because there's not as many large predators, they might have the opportunity for that injury to heal, but they might not be as healthy. Also, sometimes you might have example of greater longevity but worse overall health is you might have species that are not very healthy because they're not getting the proper nutrients that they need, but they're getting enough to be able to survive. Let's see. We also sometimes see changes in nesting habitats or nesting habits. So, for example, songbirds in urban areas, some species are known to nest higher up in the tree than they do in more rural areas. And that might have to do with how we trim our trees, or it might have to do with, the presence of non-native predators like house cats. It's harder for the house cat to get them if they're higher up in the tree. Um, let's see. We also can have changes in their feeding behavior that might just be, because of human subsidies, or maybe their natural food is not available. I want to talk just a little bit about evolution because we tend to think of evolution as this thing that happened once a long time ago and now it's done, right? But evolution is something that is still constantly ongoing, and urban areas are a great place to look for, genetic changes, small genetic changes in species. So in urban areas, we've got those barriers to dispersal, which means that populations can't interact with each other as easily as they could without those barriers. So we tend to have reduced genetic diversity in urban areas, and changes in gene abundance can happen in as little as 2 generations. Now, I'm not talking about a fish turning into a frog, right? That type of thing isn't going to happen overnight, but there are studies that have looked at kind of these examples of microevolution, these small changes in populations. And so I've got just a few examples of those here to give to you guys. So one study, they looked at crested anoles in Puerto Rico, and they found that they had longer limbs and more toe lamellae because so what I'm talking about is all of the folds that these anoles have on their toe pads, and I'm holding up my hand like you can see my hand, and you can't because my camera is off, just in case anyone needed to know that. Anyway, they have all of these folding structures on their toe pads, and that creates friction and helps them kind of stick to whatever surface it is that they're climbing. And so they think that having the longer limbs and more folds in the toes makes it easier to makes it easier for them to grab on to our man-made surfaces that don't necessarily have as much changes, that have smoother surfaces than something like a tree would. Another study took moths from a rural area and moths from an urban area, and they turned on lights. And so they took them in a lab and they turned on lights, and they found that the moths from rural areas were more likely to fly to the light than the urban moths. So urban moths are becoming less sensitive, less attracted to light. Another study found that house finches in Tucson have longer and wider beaks compared to their rural counterparts. And they think that this is because of it, that longer beak makes it easier, more powerful to eat seeds that are put in bird feeders like sunflower seeds. We also, there's another study that looked at holly hawksbeard, which is a plant that's found in the UK that is very similar to a dandelion. And so, like a dandelion, it has wind dispersed seeds. And they found that in urban areas, this plant has seeds that are heavier than those in rural areas. And so the idea behind that is that in a rural area, having a light seed, it's going to blow farther away from the parent plant, which means less competition for the parent plant, right? And greater dispersal. A heavier seed is advantageous in an urban area because where the parent plant is growing, there is suitable habitat. And so if that seed falls closer to the parent plant, then it's more likely to be able to germinate. I think I'm gonna go ahead and pause here for just a minute. If there's any questions that y'all have, I'd be happy to answer them.
This is Zoe. I love the shot of the Congress Bridge when bats are going out. If you haven't gone down to watch that, you definitely need to do it. Rachel, we haven't had any specific questions come up with all of your information. So if anybody's got something they're holding on to or would like to ask her, this is the time to do it. All right, you've had some great images, and I'm sure there's things I've seen before and sure others as well. Great images always really kind of help tell stories. So thank you for that.
All right, we will charge onward then. So what can we do to make our urban areas better for wildlife? And there's lots of things. One thing that we can do is kind of manage human-wildlife interactions. There are some species, the species that are in our cities are always going to be here to some extent, right? Like if we haven't gotten rid of them yet, despite all of our best efforts, they're still going to be here. So we need to be conscious of that, and we need to find ways to make sure that when people and wildlife are interacting, that those interactions remain positive. And so there are things that we can do to make, be conscious and make sure that we're addressing human wildlife conflict issues before they really even become a problem. We can also work to remove threats to wildlife in our cities. So this is one example is reducing light pollution. So things like, dark skies lighting, lights out initiatives, which is really starting to take off now. Lots of people are kind of getting the memo. I've been so excited to see the number of Texas cities that are participating in the Lights Out for Migrating Birds campaigns. And these things also have benefits to our human health, reducing light pollution. It's also, light pollution is also bad for us. It can mess with our natural circadian rhythms. And so there's lots of options out there for dark skies lighting. The International Dark Sky Association, darksky.org, they have lots of great information on here. We're not talking about making it dark. We're talking about shielding light so that the light goes to the ground where we need it instead of going everywhere like you see in this photo. Another thing that we can do is look at how we design our buildings and things like that. So collisions are the second leading cause of death for birds. They have a hard time. So birds see light and color in a completely different way than we do. And so they have a hard time recognizing windows sometimes. And collisions are the second leading cause of death for birds behind house cats. And that's caused by the cause of death that's caused by humans anyway. So doing things to prevent that. There are ways that you can design buildings to make them less dangerous to birds. Reducing the exterior lighting at night can also help. And putting things like net like screens or transparent film on our windows can really help out birds. We also need to be mindful of our uses of pesticides and herbicides. We've talked about this a little bit already. They can impact non-target species, and also have implications that ripple across the ecosystem. Herbicides and fertilizers and things like that also can end up in our water bodies because sometimes we use too much of them and they run off. Um, these are important tools to have in our toolbox. Sometimes we absolutely need to use pesticides and herbicides. We just need to be conscious of when we're using them and make sure that we are judicious in our use of these tools. Um, how we plan our infrastructure is also super important. We need to work when we're designing our cities to keep natural habitat in mind. Unfortunately, a lot of cities, they don't really think about this when they're small, usually because they don't have the resources. Or, the city's just so old that this just wasn't a thing that was thought of. Um, but it's really important to plan for green space in your city and where you want to have green space and maintain those natural habitat corridors um, before the city is totally built out. Because sometimes I get cities coming to me that are like, well, we want to do this, but there's very little space that the city owns that they even have the option of doing, creating green space in the cities. Um, so there are lots of things that we can do, whether it's kind of green stormwater design, or there's some really cool stuff out there too, like this picture here, which is a land bridge. So this is kind of in the beginning stages. I'm sure there's probably a more updated photo out there now, but anyway, they're going to plant this. And so this is something that it creates connectivity. So this particular one is connecting two sides of a park that were separated by a road. And this can be used by both people and wildlife to have safe passage across that road. Now, land bridges are something that have been like this thing that happened far away for a while. Like there's one in Canada or Europe, but this one right here is in San Antonio, Texas, um, which is huge. We have a land bridge in Texas, and there's another one planned for Memorial Park in Houston. So hopefully this is something that will catch on. We also can work to create habitat for wildlife in our urban areas. So this can be restoring, habitats that have um, uh, restoring habitats to their natural state. This can be putting in legal protection in place for existing green space to make sure that it doesn't get taken away in the future, and also landscaping with native plants. So yards that are landscaped with non-native plants have 29 times less biodiversity than those that use native plants. This kind of like mowed Bermuda grass with nothing else going on is totally useless to wildlife. We need to kind of rethink our yards and rethink the plants that we're choosing to plant in our yards, and how we landscape our yards. There's so many great choices. We've got lots of really great native plant options that we can use in our landscaping. And you might think, okay, why does it matter on my 0.2 acres? Well, when you zoom out and you start thinking about all of the 0.2 acre lots, you start to realize that, how we landscape our yards really has an impact on how the whole community looks. because a lot of our land is devoted to yards and cities. So we need to kind of be more mindful about how we're managing them. Because when we think about kind of on a broader scale, what do we want our communities to look like? What do we want the quality of life to be in our urban areas? Um, when we're thinking about that, you know, the presence of nature and natural elements can really improve our quality of life in cities. And so we'll talk a little bit about ways that that can help. One is water quality. Water quality is super important, and maintaining green space and allowing native vegetation to persist, reducing that impervious cover. This is one thing that can really go a long way to improve our water quality. Open space equals better water quality. It can also help with air pollution. There was a study done in 2014 that found that trees removed 17.4 million tons of air pollution in the United States in 1 year. Um, and that resulted in 850 fewer deaths from respiratory issues, and also 670,000 fewer cases of acute respiratory symptoms. So if you have if you have asthma or other sensitivities, less having cleaner air to breathe can make a really big difference. Trees and vegetation can also help us reduce the urban heat island effect. Um, a 10% increase in tree canopy cover results in a 2-degree Fahrenheit reduction in temperature. And you can even kind of design natural vegetation cover in a way that can direct kind of the flow of cooler air in the city. We need to rethink how we design our subdivisions. So a typical subdivision, the developer gets a tract of land and they just kind of build as many houses as they can on it. But if we design our subdivisions with smaller lots, um, so it's the same number of houses between these photos, but it's just smaller lots. And what that allows us to do is have some green space in our neighborhoods. And this is great because this is less so this is more overall green space that each individual has access to because this is a community area. And it's less that they have to maintain, and it's less that they have to pay taxes on. So this green space, keeping green space in our neighborhoods really benefits a lot of things. Um, so this picture, let me explain what's going on. So we have 3 different neighborhoods that you can see in this picture. The first one is right here. And so you can see there's not a whole lot of natural elements to these houses. Um, you've got houses here, and then right here you have like a very large shopping center. Like I think this is Walmart up here, and then there's like Target and J.C. Penney, and just everything is in the shopping center, okay, y'all? It's one of those mega shopping centers. Um, Over here, you have another neighborhood. Um, it you've got a road right here, and then here is a city park with hiking trails and good natural habitat. And then here is another neighborhood, maybe a little bit more established than this one. You've got a little bit more tree cover. There's not as busy of a road nearby, and you still have access to this neighborhood. So if I were to ask you, assuming that all of these houses were equal in price, which neighborhood would you want to live in? most of you are going to pick one of these two neighborhoods, right? If everything being equal, you're probably not going to want to have the major shopping center and the two busy roads, right? You'd probably rather have this because it's quieter and it's less less noise and less busy. So think now about, would you be willing to pay more to live in like this house versus this house? You know, um, how much more is that? You know, how much more is the view from your backyard worth to you? So there is a term for this, and it is called the Proximate Principle. And it's a book. It is a 200-page book that will definitely not keep you awake at night. But if you need 200 pages of empirical evidence that there is economic value in green space, then this is the book for you. So basically, the crux of it is this. There are hundreds of research studies that have shown that people are willing to pay a premium of 15 to 30% for homes that are near parks and green space. And so one way to think about this, it's kind of the same thing as waterfront property. Everyone knows waterfront property is typically going to be more expensive because people want that view. It's the same thing with green space. People would much rather overlook green space than their neighbor's backyard or a gas station or something else, you know? So the impact of this, and it doesn't have to be um, right against the park. Um, so the impact of the park is greatest within 500 to 600 feet of the park. But you still see the impact of a park within 2,000 feet of the park. And typically the cost of creating and maintaining the park is offset by the financial benefits of the park. Also, parks that are focused on natural features typically have a greater positive impact than those that don't. So there's all sorts of parks out there, and all parks have a place. We need soccer fields, we need playgrounds, but when it comes to home values, people tend to prefer parks that have natural features because living next to a playground is really great if you have a 4-year-old, but maybe not so great if you don't have a 4-year-old, right? So there can be some negative impacts that come with green spaces, but with like more recreational focused green spaces, but people still generally prefer that um, any type of park to no park. So the biggest example of this is Central Park in New York City. When Central Park was built, so this was not initially a good area of New York City. It was kind of like junk land, but Frederick Law Olmsted is the kind of architect behind Central Park, recognized the value and said, no, we need a space where there's green space in the city. And after Central Park was built, they saw a 700% increase in property value. And it's important to remember, like, they weren't intending to build Central Park as we know it today. When they built it, they were just like, we need some green space in this city. They never could have anticipated that today it provides hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue and tourism. But you might be thinking, okay, that's not, super helpful. Like, we can't build Central Park in Killeen, but it doesn't have to be Central Park. You still have a benefit. So the Austin Greenbelt is, a pretty well-known green area, green space that we have here in Texas. And it's estimated that there was a study done that found that the Austin Greenbelt generated $13.6 million in property tax revenue in just 2 neighborhoods in Austin. That is a huge difference. Okay, so the Austin Greenbelt, obviously still a pretty big project. What if it's not a big project? Well, there was a study done in DFW that looked at 14 neighborhood parks that ranged in size from 0.3 to 7.3 acres. So these are not your central parks. These are not your Fort Worth nature centers. These are not huge parks. They actually had this quote in there that the parks were a standard park of quality, well within the range of an even marginally committed developer, right? So these are like the half-assing it parks, okay? Um, and there's another quote that says that they were remarkable because of their unremarkableness. Even these parks found that the houses within half a mile had a premium of 22% compared to those that were farther away. So being within walking distance of a park, even if it's not an amazing park, makes a huge difference. Having access to nature also has significant benefits to people. It does a lot for our physical and our mental health, as well as the economic side of things. And so look at this picture. Think about how you feel when you look at this picture. It's a pretty picture. Um, Compare that to how you feel when I show this picture. So that kind of gut reaction that you might have, when I switch between these two pictures, like which one are you more likely to set as the desktop background on your computer, right? Um, that has been studied. And so lots of studies have found that natural settings and views of nature relax us. So whether we're actually in nature or even if it's just a picture of nature, that tends to make us less stressed out. And so part of this has to do with something called the stress recovery theory, which is basically thought to be an evolutionary response of the limbic system, which is kind of one of the oldest parts of the brain. And basically the idea is that when we see things like calm water, lush vegetation, some non-threatening wildlife species, and a savanna or a savanna habitat, that signals in our brain safety and food abundance, and it helps us to relax. Um, Along a similar vein, forest bathing is a practice that began in Japan in the 1980s. And this is not taking a shower in the forest. It's having like a meditative, thoughtful, kind of sensory walk through the forest. It seems honestly like it's starting to catch on here. I don't know about y'all's part of the world, but up here in DFW, I've been seeing more kind of events starting to pop up or like news articles about forest bathing. So maybe y'all are starting to hear about it too. But the idea is to just kind of walk slowly, notice the sounds, notice the smells. And it's been, studies have shown that, spending this kind of time, this calm time in the forest, is associated with a 12.4 decrease in percent decrease in cortisol, which is the stress hormone, a 1.4% decrease in blood pressure, and a 5.8% decrease in heart rate. People have also found that having access to nature really improves our happiness and our sense of well-being. There was a survey done of residents in the UK where they found that as green space increased within a 2.5 mile radius, overall well-being increased. And they also found so certain life events have effects on our mood that are generally considered positive. So they found that moving to an area with less green space to an area with more green space was 1/3 the effect of getting married and 1/10 the effect of becoming employed. So it's really something that can contribute to the happiness that people are feeling. And they controlled the study for socioeconomic factors. So it wasn't just a comparison between people living in poor neighborhoods versus wealthy neighborhoods. They kind of took that out of it. Um, it also can help with our anxiety and depression. Spending time walking in nature has been shown to decrease brain activity associated with withdrawal, sadness, and depression. Um, there was a study that found that a 1% increase in green space around someone's home resulted in a 4% lower rate of anxiety and mood disorder treatment. They also found that higher levels of green space in neighborhoods were associated with lower depression, anxiety, and stress. And they found that people with very little green space around their houses, around their homes, had a 25% greater risk of depression and a 30% greater risk of anxiety disorders. Now, I am not saying that if you're depressed or if you have anxiety, you just need to go walk outside, okay? Because these are real these are real mental health issues. But research has shown that these can help with the symptoms of these diseases. It's not going to cure it, but it can help. Um, Another issue that we're facing in the US is obesity. Over 65% of adults are overweight, 1 in 3 are obese, and childhood obesity has more than tripled in the last 30 years. Um, and this can impact our life in a lot of ways. Almost $150 billion was spent on medical costs in 2008 from health issues related to obesity because it can cause a lot of health issues like um, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and cancer. So lots of health issues can be tied to obesity. It's also found that here in the US, 50% of adults don't get the minimum um, uh, recommended amount of exercise, and 26% of adults are completely inactive during their leisure time. And, I don't think that that's just because we want to be that way, you know? I think it's just sometimes we're so busy we don't have time, you know? If you work full time and you've got kids, you've got maybe 30 minutes of free time, right? Before you have to go to bed. Um, we're busy, and so we don't necessarily have the time to find time to exercise. But studies have shown that people who live near green space are 3 times more likely to be active and 40% less likely to be obese. And people who exercise outdoors typically do so for longer periods of time and with greater intensity than people who are exercising indoors. Studies have shown that nature can even impact our healing. Um, so there was a study done where they looked at hospital patients. I believe they were recovering from gallbladder surgery, and they found that hospital patients that had a scenic view from their window recovered faster and had shorter hospital stays and required less pain medication than those that did not have a natural view. And the thought of this is kind of going back to that stress recovery theory. If you have a nice kind of relaxing view of like trees and you can see birds and all that stuff, you're going to be less stressed out, which means that the body can heal faster. Lower stress promotes faster healing. This picture here, my mom had a knee replacement a couple of years ago, and this was the view from her hospital room. Like, it's pretty depressing, right? Like, there's no forgetting where you are. And it wasn't that big of a deal. You know, she was only there for like 24 hours, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But you can imagine like an extended stay where this is your view. Like, you can even see into the other hospital rooms, right? Like, that's not very fun. I would much rather have a view, even if it's of a parking lot where I can see something green, right? Um, Access to nature has also shown improvements in elderly patients that have dementia or mobility issues. Um, Wander gardens, so this is an area where patients could, or people in assisted living facilities could go outside, but in a kind of like a safe environment. They found that that was associated with 30% fewer falls and less serious falls and a 10% reduce in medication. On the opposite end of the spectrum, access to nature can also be super important and beneficial for our kids. This book, Last Child in the Woods, it's a great book. I recommend you give it a read if you haven't read it before. It kind of coins the term nature deficit disorder, which is not an actual disease, but just kind of like a term for the increasing lack of access to nature in our kids. Um, and it kind of talks about all of the benefits of kids spending time in nature. So there was a study that was done where they looked at two identical high rises in Chicago. One of the buildings had a view of a park, the other one did not. And they found that the kids in the building that had the view of the park had higher scores on concentration, impulse inhibition, and delayed gratification tests. Um, Access to nature has also been shown to benefit um, children with ADHD and adults with ADHD too. There was a study that took children with ADHD on walks in two different environments. The kids that went on a walk in the more natural environment had greater test scores it showed greater improvements in attention. So this is something that, you know, can help the symptoms. Again, like anxiety and depression, ADHD is a real disease. Spending time outside is not going to cure it, but it can help reduce some of the symptoms. Access to nature can also help with childhood obesity. There was a study that looked at kids aged 10 to 12, and they found that for every hour they spent outside resulted in an additional 20 to 27 minutes of physical activity per week. And they did a follow-up study after 3 years and showed that the kids that spent time outside had a 27 to 41% lower occurrence of obesity compared to those that did not spend time outside. It also can help improve test scores. A study done of 905 elementary schools in Connecticut, they looked at the vegetation cover around the schools and they found higher test scores with more vegetation cover. And also schools with classrooms with um, views of green space. They found the students had higher test scores, higher graduation rates, and more kids planning to go to college. Um, I talked a little bit about economic benefits already with the proximate principle, but there's even more economic benefits as well. So nature tourism is a really huge industry, and we underestimate it a lot. Um, Corpus Christi estimates that nearly $1 billion in business revenue and almost 13,000 jobs are generated every year because of nature tourism. And 47% of all visitor trips to Corpus Christi um, were reported as having to do with nature. And so I get it. You're probably thinking they have the beach. That's not fair. Well, you don't have to have the beach. Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin, the largest urban bat colony. There's an estimated 1.5 million bats that live in this bridge, and thousands of people come every year to watch these bats emerge. And it is free to go and see the bats. It is not free to ride on one of these boats. It's also not free if you want a hotel room or even to stop and get dinner or some drinks before or after the bats come out. So the presence of these bats on Congress Avenue Bridge is estimated to have an economic value of $7.9 million every year to the city of Austin. Birders. Do we have any birders on this call? Birders are crazy, right? Like, birders love birds. They are willing to spend a lot of money to go and see birds. And I mean crazy in a good way. We're all a little bit crazy. Um, so there's an estimated 46 million birders in the United States, and they spend $40 billion annually on their hobby. That is not a small amount of money. The yellow-green vireo is a rare species that is present in the lower Rio Grande Valley. And it's one of the only places, if the only place, that you can see it in the United States. And it's estimated that the presence of that one bird generates $100,000 in local spending in these small communities in the Rio Grande Valley. That's a huge difference. And I think it's really important, no offense to yellow-green vireo, but it is not like the most fantastic looking bird in the entire world, right? But it's a rare species that people can check off of their life list. Um, and it's important to remember that the wildlife that we have in our communities, we underestimate it a lot of times. So there was one day, my office is at Cedar Hill State Park, and there was one day that I got to my office, and as I was driving by a little ways across from my office, there were all of these birders over there. And they were like the truly crazy birders, the ones that have like the giant lenses on their cameras that kind of look like it needs like a separate support just for the camera lens. Um, there was a bunch of them, and they were over in this one area. They had all of their equipment set up, and they were obviously looking for birds and pointing and all excited. So I get to my office and I said to my coworker, I said, "Did you see all of those birders over there?" And I'm thinking, there's got to be something really cool, right? There's got to be some like unusual species that has shown up, like a snowy owl that may be here once in a blue moon. And so we go over and we're excited to see like whatever rare bird it is, right? And it turns out that they were Asian tourists. And they were over there so excited and having the time of their lives just looking at Carolina chickadees and Eastern phoebes and birds that we really don't think about all that much, right? But they were exciting to them, and they were here to experience those birds and see those birds. And so this is what I mean when I say we have a huge nature tourism industry in Texas. We tend to take the stuff that we see on an everyday basis for granted. Um, but we've got a lot of really cool wildlife here, and we should be proud of it. So the outdoor recreation industry is huge. It is not a small cottage industry. In Texas alone, it's over 400,000 jobs, $15 billion in wages, $52 billion in consumer spending, and $3.5 billion in tax revenue. Nationwide, the outdoor recreation industry is 7.6 million jobs, 887 billion in consumer spending, and $124 billion in tax revenue. So again, not a small industry. So that's more or less all I have. I will say, if y'all are interested in kind of like the second part of the presentation, any of this human benefits of nature, so human health and well-being, and also the economic benefits. There's a lot of research about all of this, and I think it's really important field of study, because these messages about like what do people get out of it, they tend to resonate with people who aren't that connected to nature or don't necessarily understand the benefit of nature. Everyone on this call, I am preaching to the choir. You know, you get it. You wouldn't be a master naturalist if you didn't. But with other people, it's really helpful to kind of hear these things sometimes. Like, what are the concrete, tangible benefits of having nature in our communities? And I think so. These are some resources. Here's the Proximate Principle that I told you about. Um, if you're looking for kind of like short, easy to digest documents, Urban Nature for Human Health and Well-Being and the Outside Our Doors report are both good. If you really want to do a deep dive and you want like thousands of things to read, the Green Cities Good Health website is where you need to go. They've got so much information, and they even have it like broken down by certain categories. Like if you're interested in anxiety or ADHD or obesity, like those, they've got it kind of broken down into different categories. Um, and so that's pretty much it. And I just want to say also, in case this wasn't clear before, it is so important to think about the nature in our communities, because, a lot of times when we think about nature, we think about faraway places, but the nature that we really experience is the stuff in our backyard or the stuff at our community park. And I think most of us probably develop our love for nature because of those experiences that we have with the everyday stuff, right? With the birds that come to our feeder, or that rabbit that we see in our yard, or the wildflowers that we see in our community. Um, and making sure that people have those experiences, and also making sure that wildlife is able to continue existing alongside us, is really kind of what being focusing on urban ecology is all about. Um, and there's lots of things that we can do to make sure that we have a good, healthy, strong, and healthy ecosystems in our urban areas. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to address them now.
Rachel, I'll just make a comment. This is a fascinating field about urbanization, and something that I'm really interested in. And I just would make a comment that another way that we can help is to become involved in our community with the city council or other ways that they struggle. City council, I would never want to be one of those people. They may want to do the right thing, but they have to have the support of the community. And I think as master naturalists, we are part of that community that can provide support, but also just learning about what it takes to do some of these things in urban areas. The land bridge, I was in kind of a tabletop exercise where we had this community, and there were several things we could do. And one was build a land bridge. And of course, everybody's like, oh, yeah, let's do that. But it was like millions and millions of dollars. And we can't even hardly get school bonds passed. So it's a difficult task. And I'm a believer that all of us individually can make a difference, even in our own backyards. It doesn't take giant land bridges to make a difference, but it is very complex, and that's just another way sometimes we as knowledgeable people can help our communities.
Yes. So thank you for that, Zoe, because that is a really great point. Because as master naturalists, y'all are really in the perfect position to implement change in your communities. So I work a lot with the master naturalist in my position, and I am the advisor for the Cross Timbers Master Naturalist chapter. Um, so I see a lot of the great work that y'all do. And y'all really have a unique ability to use that kind of hyper local knowledge of what's going on, next to your house or whatever, and polite persistence, of getting to know, and I'm not saying don't knock on, your local park employees or city councilman's door and, say, change all of this stuff. But y'all are really good at developing relationships with the people who are able to implement change over time, and kind of just starting out with those like really base level discussions of like, oh, hey, what's going on? I noticed this was happening at this park and I'd like to know more about it because I love this park. And yeah, master naturalists are so great at causing change for the better in their communities.
I saw it at one park here over in Harker Heights, and then I had read about it somewhere else a little bit more down south. But instead of building the land bridges that go over the road, they built where it went under the road for wildlife to be able to go under instead. Um, so that they wouldn't get hit. Have you seen a lot of that?
Yeah, so culverts and bridges can definitely facilitate wildlife movement. And there's different ways that you can design them or retrofit them depending on the species. Some species don't like to get their feet wet, right? So some species you might need kind of like a little ledge on the side for them to use it. Or some species don't really like to feel like they're exposed and out in the open, so a huge culvert might not work for them, and a smaller one will. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, something like a white-tailed deer is going to need like a bigger space, so like a bridge might be more beneficial there, or a very large culvert. So yeah, those things absolutely can be used for wildlife. Sometimes it's good to see them coupled with fencing as well to kind of direct the critters towards where you want them to cross so they're not tempted to go up onto the road.
All right, any other questions for Rachel? All right, Rachel, that was amazing. That was a lot of information.
Yeah, it's a very good presentation, Rachel. I enjoyed that. It was very good.
Well, great. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much, Rachel. This was great today.